of the key hallmarks of a fair legal process is the notion of independence, that whoever it is who's sitting there up at the front of the courtroom is someone who has no vested interests, is not going to favor one side over the other.
Is going to make a judgment.
A judgment
based on the evidence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we and others all along have said that is the fatal flaw of the military commission process, the fact that the judge is a military man or woman, I guess he could be, and therefore is not a neutral player.
I read in your blogs from there the heartbreaking story of Omar's eyes and the difficulty that he had around that and the judge's reaction. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that.
Well, on the second day of the proceedings when I was there, the first day Omar had appeared for the proceedings and was very engaged and clearly following things. There was a lot of back and forth and exchanges between him and his legal team. You know, I and others weren't allowed to have any contact or discussions with him, but I was very struck by how present and engaged he clearly was. The second day of the proceedings, we all came into the courtroom early in the morning, and there was no Omar. Instead, a U.S. soldier took the stand, and she testified as to the various steps that had been apparently taken that morning to try to bring him to the hearing. Her testimony was that he had refused to come. And this is quite a significant issue, because obviously in any legal process, even the unfair legal proceedings at Guantanamo Bay, the right to be present at your trial is essential. It's absolutely essential. And with respect to the military commission processes, it's even more important, because built into the rules is not only the guarantee that you have the right to be there, it goes further and says, if you voluntarily, key word, choose not to be there, that can be held against you. So if you voluntarily choose not to come to your hearings, at some later point the judge could hold that against you as you're uncooperative. Could he, I suppose, even use that to cast doubts on your credibility, who knows what. So it becomes a very important issue. Well, she described that early that morning, when she had been involved in efforts to rouse him and start the long and complicated process of bringing him out of the detention camps and across the base over to the courtroom, he was complaining about pain in his eyes. Well, we have to, sort of as a footnote here, remember that back at the time of that terrible firefight, when Omar was apprehended and so badly injured, amongst the many injuries he experienced was an incredible amount of shrapnel in both of his eyes.
Both eyes.
Both eyes, to the point now where he's blind virtually in one of the eyes and has ongoing pain and discomfort in both of his eyes. He was taken to the medical clinic, I think they even call it hospital, on the base that is there for the detainees, and apparently was given some eye drops and then sent off, and assurances that would take care of it, he should be pain-free. But he still didn't show up at the courtroom, so she looked into it further. This is the testimony we're hearing from this soldier, and is told that he's in the back of the van, the transport van that's supposed to bring him over, but that he's refusing to wear what she describes as the eyes and ears. Well, eyes and ears turn out to be a set of very tight-fitting goggles and earmuffs that are occasionally used in a variety of national security settings as a way of sensory deprivation, and are sometimes used when people are being transported here and there. Apparently has by no means regularly been used in the past with him.
What would be the logic? That he's not allowed to see where he's going through?
That's it, absolutely, or hear. And the goggles are opaque, so you can't see out of them. It becomes a bit absurdist, though, because he's being transported in a windowless van.
Right, that's what I was
so
thinking.
What the need of it is was never made clear. But he is apparently complaining about being forced to wear the eyes and ears for two reasons. Number one, that they're painful and uncomfortable, and number two, that he finds them humiliating. I think, because of this very point. Why am I being required to do so? I was cooperative. I'm in a windowless van. What's the point here? She insists back to him that he has to wear them. This is standard operating procedure, which appears to be in doubt, actually, later. But he says, I won't. She says, therefore, you're not coming to court. So this is what we hear her testify about. His lawyers then ask her a few questions, but essentially she has just laid out the facts of what happened. There's not much that can be debated or disputed as to what she has said. They then want to call two witnesses. One is a medical witness. There's present on the base at that time a remarkable man who's a retired U.S. Brigadier General. He's a child psychiatrist. He's also a general physician. So it's quite a remarkable combination of skills and background. And he has spent, I think, something in the range of about 100 hours or even more than that, carrying out detailed interviews and assessments of Omar Khadr over the past couple of years. Obviously has an incredible amount of expertise and perspective to offer the court as to what's going on here, how this may be related to the medical problems around pain in his eyes, even some of the psychiatric issues around humiliation, etc.
So was he allowed to testify?
Just let me tell you who the other witness, quite interestingly, was there was a Canadian consular official who was present in the court at that time, who had apparently had a visit with Omar quite late in the day before. And my understanding was that her evidence, which she wouldn't have offered directly because she's a Canadian official and therefore couldn't testify, but would have been offered indirectly through someone else taking the stand, was that she was going to provide information about the fact that it was the day before, on the way back from court to the prison camp, that for the first time the eyes and ears were being used, and she was going to describe how that was a change of policy, how humiliating and difficult Omar found it, etc. So again, obviously relevant, regardless of what conclusions you drew from it, obviously relevant. So his lawyer takes to his feet and describes that he wants to call these two witnesses, gives a very brief sense for the judge as to why he wants to call them, and essentially what the judge decides is, no, I'm not going to hear from them. I see absolutely no reason to, and you know what? I'm even going to, I'll give you that I'm going to accept everything they would tell me. That they're going to convince me that yes, there are some medical problems, some discomfort, and maybe this was a change in policy and it wasn't standard policy. But then looks very intently at the judge and says, but that doesn't matter because I will not second guess the decisions that are made on this base with respect to security matters. It was a stunning moment. I mean, it was with respect to a very small point. We're not at a level of guilt or innocence or the big issues that need to be determined in a trial. But it was a stunning moment because that is precisely the judge's role. There is no one else in a legal proceeding who is charged with the responsibility of second-guessing. That is why we have judges. I felt this overwhelming desire to leap to my feet and say, excuse me, Your Honor, have you read your job description? Yeah. Please be judicial here. I don't know what second-guessing you will do in the end, but please at least second-guess. That's why we have judges.
It's a frightening portent of,
it really
of
is.
what
You
could be
could
coming.
see that for him, he's a military man, and he has his certain place in the military system. And there are others who have their place in the military system, including those who make decisions around security matters, including decisions around security matters that will directly impact on the nature of his legal proceedings. But he's got his job, they've got their jobs, and let's not mess with each other. It couldn't have more starkly underscored to me what is so problematic around the whole way these proceedings are set up at Guantanamo Bay and the profound lack of independence.
Well, one of the things that really strikes me in the case is that, assuming the trial goes ahead, that this will be the first child soldier to be put on trial since World War II. And through all the horrible wars we've been in the last 50 or 60 years, no child soldier has been put on trial. And it's a stunning fact when you look at when Obama came into power and promised all of these changes at Guantanamo and changes in American attitude. Why do you think he's proceeding with letting this trial happen?
It's the million-dollar question, Kelly, and everyone's asking it all the time. We all felt the exhilaration in January of 2009 when President Obama made his famous "it will be closed within a year" speech. That obviously didn't happen. We're well past a year, and last fall it was already very clear that it wasn't going to happen in the way he had promised. It wasn't going to be a complete closure. It wasn't going to be a closure for everyone. That yes, some proceedings were going to go ahead, but it was going to be better. There was going to be reforms to the military commission process. The trials would be fairer and all these sorts of things. And there have been some improvements. It is nonetheless stunning that the first case that the Obama administration is using to demonstrate to the world that there's a new approach to justice and human rights protection at Guantanamo Bay is a child soldier who has made very disturbing allegations of torture, against whom the charge is that he threw a grenade in the middle of a war that killed a soldier, which is really what happens in war. I mean, I'm not saying it is a good thing or an acceptable thing that a U.S. soldier was killed that day, but that is what war happens. So it's stunning that is the case that is going forward as sort of this message to the world that there's a new, fairer, better way to how Guantanamo is being handled. No one can really understand it. Certainly there has always been this sense that with Omar's case, as opposed to a lot of the other cases, there's something deeply personal about the case for many within the U.S. military, because whereas a lot of the other detainees at Guantanamo are charged with offenses like conspiracy or assistance or material support, in Omar Khadr's case, it's you killed a U.S. soldier. So it becomes very personal. It's something that for people within the military itself, therefore, it's hard to let go of. Even though the evidence as to whether or not he really did throw that grenade is, at the very least, highly dubious, and more, as time goes past and we get more revelations about the evidence, the strength of those accusations is starting to fade quite dramatically. So that's a piece of it. I hope that another piece of it is that it just has not yet really made its way in front of President Obama yet, in the way that if it did, I want to feel confident he would look at it and say, no, this is not the direction I want to go in. And therefore, I think it continues for those of us who focus more on the human rights advocacy side of this case. It is important to keep up the pressure on both sides of the border. I mean, clearly we need to keep trying to find the way that will finally push Canada to do the right thing on this case. But that, yes, south of the border, we need to keep up that pressure as well, because I like to hold on to this hope that if we can finally succeed in getting the case really put in front of President Obama in the right way, where the issues are very clear, he'll see it, as the rest of us will. He's a man who believes in justice and rights, and I know he would not want this to be how he says to the world that Guantanamo under his watch is going to look like this.
Well, let us cling to that faint hope. And I'd certainly like to talk more about Canada's role in all of this. But I see that we're joined now by Mr. Khadr's defense attorney, Dennis Edney in Edmonton. Welcome, Dennis.
Good morning.
Morning. Perhaps you could begin by just telling us the latest on the court appeal that you made just a few days ago, and why you did the appeal and what you hope it will what you hope will come out of it.
Well, as you know, the Supreme Court of Canada made a declaration that Canada should do something for Omar Khadr. And the lower court of appeal indicated that something should be requested as repatriation. Our government chose not to do that. Our government instead chose to ask the Americans whether they would not use the evidence that they had illegally obtained from Omar Khadr while interrogating him under the egregious situation that he was in. And what was also significant about that request was that request didn't go to President Obama. The request went to the prosecutors in Guantanamo Bay. So it never, as far as we know, ever arrived on the desk of President Obama. And our position was that there should be a review of this approach and this request, because it's a breach of Omar Khadr's rights of natural justice. Nobody spoke to us about what would be in Omar's best interest. we are Omar's spokesperson. And so we made that argument before the court. I think it was heard well. I think the court will rule within the next few weeks. But at the end of the day, what will it really do? All it does is allows us to have some input, and with reasonable people that may have influenced the government's approach. But 8 years of having a deafening silence from both the past Liberal and now present Conservative government, we don't put much hope on that.
Well, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about why you think the Canadian government is being so intransigent, if I can use that word, about bringing Omar home when every other nation has brought their nationals home. Do you have any sense of what is driving them? And perhaps, Alex, you can also tune in on that.
Well, it's the multi-million-dollar question. Here we have, as Alex indicated, a child soldier. We spend Canadian tax dollars in assisting and rehabilitating child soldiers out of countries such as Sierra Leone, where tremendous atrocities were taken by these child soldiers. And yet here we have Omar Khadr, whom we refuse to provide any type of international protection to that. And so coming back to your question, why is that? I wish I knew. I truly do. Perhaps it's as simple as the fact that President, early morning here, Prime Minister Harper simply is an individual who's made a decision that he doesn't like Omar Khadr, he doesn't like what he stands for, and that he's playing to his political base here in Alberta. I don't know. But I have on numerous occasions indicated to Prime Minister Harper through the media that when he looks at his own children and puts them to bed at night time, would he wish his children to be treated like Omar Khadr?
Alex, what sense do you get in terms of the public's attitude to this and in your own campaign in Canada? How do you figure Mr. Harper's intransigence?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dennis is quite right. I think this is cold, crass political calculation on Prime Minister Harper's part. There's been a lot of polling done over the years tracking the mood and concerns of the Canadian public with respect to Omar Khadr's case. It usually comes in around 50%, a little bit either direction, but certainly there's about half of Canadians who are very concerned about the approach the Harper government has taken and want the Canadian government to be more forceful and really intervene to protect Omar Khadr's rights. But I think the analysis that probably gets done of those numbers within the Prime Minister's office is that those are 50% of Canadians who probably, no matter what happens, would never vote for us, whereas those who do vote for us and those who might vote for us are more or less pleased with how we're handling this case. So why would we do something that's going to please people who will never vote for us and will enrage and upset those who do? And I think it comes down to those kinds of political calculations, which is so disheartening.
Well, just hypothetically, if a miracle happened and there was a change and Omar Khadr was brought back here, what would happen to him? What would you recommend would happen to him, and what do you think might happen to him?
Well, what I'd recommend and what I are two different things. In terms of recommendation, years ago we came up with a reintegration plan, a plan that would satisfy the concerns of Canadians and Americans alike should this young man ever leave that hellhole Guantanamo Bay. And that plan was based upon compassion and common sense. Firstly, he would be assessed by top doctors, both medical and psychiatric. In fact, we had one of the world's leading experts on torture, Dr. Payne, who agreed to be part of that assessment process. And we said that once he was assessed both physically and mentally, we would then rely upon the recommendations by those professionals. Secondly, we were aware of the notorious name of the Khadr family and how it doesn't resonate well in Canada. And so we agreed that Omar Khadr, should he be released, would not go to live with his family. That in fact he would live with a Canadian family that would give him good family values.
I do believe at one point you even offered to take him in yourself. Is that right?
Omar Khadr is more than willing to come and live with me, and I'm more than willing, as my wife is, as my children are, to have him. Why? Because he is a beautiful young man who seems to somehow have avoided carrying any hate or any anger towards those who have abused him. And when I say that, I hope I'm not going on too long, but I constantly say that I've never met anybody like Omar Khadr, who has been so abused and so abandoned by so many who should know better. And yet, he has a strong humanity about him. But not only would he come to my home, but we have a university here called King's University, which my oldest boy attends. And they have offered to help his educational process, both through high school and through university. So we offer a future for Omar Khadr, the kind of future that he deserves, having suffered what he suffered.
But alas, I think as we all know, the more likely outcome is that this trial will proceed in August. And I wonder if you could look ahead to that trial and give us some idea of what you think it will look like.
And before we get there, Kelly, is that we have to decide whether we actually even want to go into that trial. I've just come back from Guantanamo. Alex was, prior to my arrival, Alex had been there and listened to the first part of the suppression hearings. And in speaking for Alex, and I'm sure he'll agree, I don't believe that he left there having some sense of belief in the legitimacy of that process or even that judge. Omar Khadr stands to spend life in prison when he goes at trial. And he also stands to spend many, many years in jail, even if he were to plead guilty prior to trial. So we're in a horrible situation here as we come close to countdown. Whatever happens, in my view, no miracles are going to occur, because the miracle that we need is from Prime Minister Harper. Omar Khadr is going to spend years in jail, one way or the other.
You mean the choices now are between his pleading, quote, guilty to these charges or facing a trial where he will inevitably be found guilty?
Yes. And Omar Khadr, for him, was a very honest individual. Why would he plead guilty to charges he doesn't believe in? That's always part of any process when you speak to a client. And when he goes into trial, he's also going to recognize that the trial process itself is tainted. It's tainted from many of the examples given by Alex. But we're also going into a trial where the judges refused to provide essential witnesses to us that could talk about Omar Khadr's abuse, both in the hospital in Bagram and also in Guantanamo Bay. So in addition, I'm sorry, Kelly.
I was just going to ask, what possible reason can the judge give for denying those witnesses?
Well, the possible reason is the judge is biased. And I say that not out of some anger as he defends counsel, but you have to recall the history of this. We had Judge Brownback, who was Omar Khadr's trial judge. And at some point in the proceedings, Judge Brownback had threatened to shut down the military commission trial unless we received full disclosure. And over the following few days after he made that ruling, he was removed by the government. as a clear interference in the judicial system. And in pops Judge Powers. And his first ruling was, let's move this matter on for trial. And that is his job. His job is to move this matter on for trial, get a finding of guilt, and he's done his job.
You know, going back to the original purpose of this program, which is to explore the tension between human rights and the need for global security, what contribution does the Omar Khadr prosecution make to global security? Can either of you answer that question?
Well, I'll answer that first.
Well, I think that's an incredibly important question to ask, because I think the answer is it doesn't. Both on the side of the growing pile of profound injustices in Omar Khadr's case, but also on the security side, the millions and millions of dollars being spent to ensure that a tortured child soldier, who very well may not even have thrown the grenade that he stands accused of, is going to face justice, is somehow going to make this a safer world. I don't think there's a strong national security message here either. So it fails on both counts.
And Guantanamo itself, what is the message we send to other countries and to other people? That we send a message of hypocrisy. We're asking other countries to behave themselves according to standards that we think they should follow, when we don't even follow the rule of law by allowing such a place as Guantanamo Bay to exist. And remember, Omar Khadr has now been here 8 years, and he's now coming up for trial. What about the hundreds of other people at Guantanamo Bay who continue to await trial? It's just a farce. And it's an indictment on all of us here in Canada. Because how can we talk about a civil society and that we are civil people when we allow a place that is an absolute flaunts what we stand for to exist?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Edney, and we wish you all the best in your incredibly important work, and you have our admiration for doing it.
So thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you, Alex.
Okay, good to talk to you, Dennis.
Okay.
What's the next step in the campaign to bring Omar back home?
Well, I think we're keeping up the pressure on both sides of the border. We have to, because the solution to his case really is only going to come if both the Canadian and American governments get together and find a commitment to ensuring that justice is actually going to prevail in this case and bring these years of injustice to an end. So certainly here in Canada, people who are concerned can still and should still be writing their MP, should be writing cabinet ministers, and above all else should be writing Prime Minister Harper with that clear message that has been the message for the last 2 or 3 years now, that Omar Khadr should be brought home, that his repatriation needs to be a priority for the Canadian government. South of the border, there's also campaigning going on. I think we're seeing a lot more attention within the U.S. media and U.S. civil liberties and human rights groups paying a lot more attention to Omar Khadr's case than was the case in the past, and that's good to see. I think especially this fact that it is the first case that the Obama administration is using to unleash the new Guantanamo Bay has really captured the attention of many within the United States. So hopefully we can ride that to start to build increased pressure on the U.S. administration as well, to stop this foolishness, to not proceed with a trial, and to work immediately with the Canadian government to find a solution that's going to bring him back to Canada instead.
Now, there's some people who argue that because Omar Khadr is a child soldier who was not recruited by being drugged or having his parents killed or kidnapped, he was a member of a family who seemed willingly to go into this activity, that he's somehow different. He's not really a child soldier. What's your reaction to that?
There's absolutely no basis for drawing those kinds of distinctions. In international law, the standards are very clear. It doesn't matter what it is that pushed or propelled or compelled or forced or volunteered a child out onto the battlefield. It is against international law in any circumstances to involve a child under the age of 18 in warfare, in armed conflict. So whatever it is that led Omar Khadr to be in the middle of that firefight in July of 2002, and I think most likely it's the sort of upbringing he received, I would say, the very poor influence that his father brought into his life, and who knows what other influences he was receiving from other adults in and around his father. That's clearly, in some way, shape, or form, what led to him being there that day. But the bottom line, under international law and under Canadian law, is he was 15 years old, and therefore he deserves protection. And that is what the Canadian government and the U.S. government are both completely failing to take any account of.
What effect do you think his case is having on the public's perception about the tug between rights and global security?
I think his case, coming in the wake of a number of other cases, not just in Canada but around the world, Meher Arar's case would be another very good example, cases that have really highlighted for Canadians that, you know what, we need to take a breath and do some second guessing when our government says to us, it's all about national security, don't ask any questions, don't worry, we're doing the right thing, this is the way it has to be. You don't have a right to have any more information about what is happening, but trust us, we're doing the right thing. I think these cases have started to get Canadians more curious, more worried, and recognizing that there is a very key human rights dimension to national security cases that we cannot afford to let go of, and that when it comes into sharp focus in a case like Omar Khadr's, we need to all stand up and ask those questions and maintain pressure on our governments to make sure that they're not selling human rights short in the name of the supposed name of our collective security.
I know that there have been Canadian journalists who followed the case of Omar Khadr quite closely, and they were, I think 3 or 4 of them were recently banned from the trial for mentioning the name of an interrogator whose name was very public to begin with. What effect do you think the silence of their voices will have on the continuing coverage of the case?
That was stunning, and it's very worrying. It happened towards the tail end of this most recent set of hearings that were held in late April and early May. There were 4 journalists in total, 3 of whom are Canadian. From the Toronto Star, Michelle Shepard, who is the dean of the reporting that has happened with respect to Omar Khadr. Paul Coring from the Globe and Mail and Stephen Edwards from Can West, both of whom very respected journalists, seasoned journalists, experienced journalists, and all 3 of them have been at Guantanamo Bay many times and have followed this case very closely. In addition, a journalist named Carol Rosenberg, who's with the Miami Herald, who is the empress of Guantanamo Bay reporting from the very beginning, and has done incredible work over the years to make sure that the issues and stories of Guantanamo Bay are in front of the world's public. They're the 4 who have now been excluded, silencing their voices in a context where it's already so difficult to get meaningful information, to get clear information out to the world, is hugely problematic. Now, they're appealing those bans, and I understand lawyers are engaging with Pentagon lawyers, and they're, I think, trying to find a way around this.
I saw an editorial recently in the Washington Post calling for revoking of that ruling, which was quite a strong piece.
Yeah, I think many voices have waded into the debate and have made it very clear that this is completely unacceptable. And I guess at this point we remain hopeful that it will be overturned, and that it will be overturned in time for them to be present again and on the ground and doing reporting when the next stage of Omar Khadr's case happens.
How has this case affected you personally?
Well, I think for me, and I think for many Canadians concerned about rights and justice, it's been a very disturbing case to be part of for a whole variety of reasons, but certainly the Canadian piece of it is how demoralizing it has been to see our government so unwilling to do what human rights demands in this case. It has never been, no one has asked the Canadian government to do something absolutely radical and off the map. They have asked the Canadian government to take a stand that is clearly consistent with international human rights obligations that Canada has, to do so in the context of a solid proposal for a reintegration plan that Dennis Edney referred to earlier, that is by no means reckless, has a whole host of world-renowned mental health professionals and spiritual advisors and educational institutions involved that would ensure that if Omar Khadr came back, that things would go smoothly and responsibly and professionally. But nonetheless, time after time after time, what we see from the Canadian government, instead of willingness to do the right thing with human rights, is defiance. And I think that is particularly upsetting for me as a Canadian.
Well, Alex, we do have some questions now from people who are watching. Jean Leon is asking you, what is the current legal opinion on whether the Canadian government has complied with the Supreme Court ruling?
Well, I guess it depends on whose opinion you ask. Clearly, government lawyers will say they did comply with it, that the Supreme Court did not require the government to do any particular action after the ruling, and certainly did not require that the Canadian government seek his repatriation. They will argue that the very half-hearted, half-measures response we saw, which, as Dennis explained earlier, was simply this request that went not to senior political officials, but to Pentagon officials, asking that some evidence be excluded from the proceeding, a request that was denied, in the end anyway, was full compliance. I certainly would disagree with that. The Supreme Court was very clear in stating that there are serious human rights violations, breaches of the Charter of Rights that have happened in Mr. Khadr's case, and that those breaches continue. And so the fact that even if that was arguably a half-hearted attempt to comply with the ruling, the fact that it was denied means the human rights violations are continuing. And at the very least now, Canada has to come up with another approach. What are they going to do, given that their first attempt failed? We would say the only credible, reasonable option still in front of the Canadian government is the repatriation request. But it's going to take moving mountains, I think, to convince Prime Minister Harper that he should do that.
Now, I'm not sure whether on our first program out I have said goodbye to Mr. Edney or whether he's still with us. But we do have a question from one of our viewers who's asking Mr. Edney, but perhaps you can attempt to answer this, Alex. Some lawyers say that Omar should be tried in a civilian U.S. court. Do you agree with that? What do you think the outcome would be if he was tried in a civilian court?
Well, we and others said that years ago. For quite a while, that was actually the main demand in Omar Khadr's case, before this whole message of seeking his repatriation became the dominant theme. And as it became increasingly clear over the years that the U.S. had absolutely no interest in transferring his case into the civilian court system, that's when everyone moved instead to, okay, if we're not going to see justice in the U.S., which arguably could have been provided if he was to be tried in the federal court system as opposed to the military commission process, the only option open is to bring him back to Canada. I mean, clearly still, that would be an option, but I think at this point in time there's so much water under the bridge that it's very clear that the U.S. has absolutely no interest in transferring his case into the civilian court system in the U.S., and
because
that's
there,
why
certainly the evidence related to torture would have to come forward, would it not?
there are many more protections, and I think people are even confident that the child soldier issue, which in the federal courts might not be named child soldier, it may be juvenile offender.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that he was 15 years old at the time of his alleged offense would also be taken much more seriously. But I think the bottom line is it's clear. The U.S. administration has no intention, no interest in transferring Omar Khadr's case into the civilian court system, so repatriation really continues to be the main demand here.
Okay, we also have a third question from Kimball. How has the Canadian media picked up on this issue? Is there a chill around security issues?
I would actually say that we've seen some very good reporting, both with respect to Omar Khadr's case in particular, but I think the wider issues around this whole security and human rights debate that have played out in a number of Canadian cases over the past several years. I think with Omar Khadr's case, we've seen some valiant reporting. I referred earlier to Michelle Shepard's work. She obviously deserves particular kudos. The tenacity with which she has repeatedly gone down to Guantanamo Bay, written a book, done numerous feature pieces in the Toronto Star, has often been one who's been able to expose and push the case forward, has been one of the ones who's come forward with some of the revelations around how weak the evidentiary base against Omar Khadr is, for instance, and has never been bowed or cowed by the tough environment at Guantanamo Bay or intimidation that she's ever felt from U.S. military officials. So I think I've seen some very good reporting. Obviously, it could always be better. Clearly, I think one of the things that has been a challenge with respect to Omar Khadr's case is that while we've seen some very good print reporting, we haven't, I don't think, seen as much TV and radio reporting. Reporters will tell you that's because it's a very hard story to tell. Especially the TV journalists will tell you that, because there's so many restrictions put on what they are or are not allowed to film when they're down at Guantanamo Bay, for instance, and so they can't get good visuals, etc.
Of course, they can never get to the subject himself.
Absolutely. So there, I think, it's not so much that the media has felt a chill, it's that the very onerous restrictions that have been placed on how the reporting can happen has made it very difficult for it to be a compelling TV and radio story. And that's unfortunate because, of course, especially I think with TV reporting, we live in an era where that's the way where a lot of people really get sort of motivated, and where you reach a lot of people. And I think that's
What
a
about
problem.
online? I'd be curious about whether you're getting a lot of response online, because, again, that's where a lot of young people go, and whether his case is...
Oh, I think it is. I think on the internet, within the blogosphere, Facebook, there's a huge Facebook page out there, that's a Facebook group that's in support of Omar Khadr. There's a lot of activity that happens on Twitter and other fora like that. I think within social media, there's a lot of concern and a lot of activity on Omar Khadr's case. Clearly always needs to be much more, and much of that perhaps needs to start to become much more focused and strategic, so that we can reach the Canadian government in ways that we haven't been able to so far, that it doesn't feel like it's simply the same people talking to each other on internet chat and other things about the case, and that we're really finding a way to break through and reach those close to the Prime Minister.
Well, it would seem that the next 6 weeks or so before his alleged trial will begin in August are pretty critical to trying to make something happen.
I think that's true. The next thing that happens is that in mid-July there will be another set of hearings, pre-trial hearings. This time largely it's going to be the dueling psychiatric and psychological witnesses, so psychiatrists and psychologists for the defense team, psychiatrists and psychologists for the prosecution, all of whom will be offering their views on whether he's been tortured, if so, how badly, what the impact therefore might be on all of testimony. That's going to be quite a critical stage because that will lay the ground for the judge's ruling as to whether he is or is not going to exclude some, much, all of the statements that were taken from Omar Khadr. I think we're all very pessimistic that he's not very likely to issue a very strong ruling there. He could surprise us, but much of that will depend on how that evidence plays out in July. So that's the next stage to watch very carefully, and I think depending on how that goes, that may well be what shifts the balance as to how both the prosecution and the defense feel about the possibility of finding a deal here. Whoever emerges in July feeling most bolstered and buoyed by how things have gone will probably feel more sort of bolstered and buoyed as to the position they can take around a plea deal.
Well, it's certainly, Omar's case will be something Prison Magazine and this program will be following, and I really am grateful for your dedication to the issue and to your presence here today. So thanks very much, Alex. And thank you very much to all of you for joining this first edition of Rights and Security. Goodbye for now.